Well, now, as we begin chapter 23, you will note a picture on the screen. This is a tiny portion selected from a 1-inch equals 50-foot model of ancient Jerusalem that is located in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. What we are looking at is the northern wall of the temple complex, as realized through history and the writings of Josephus. This was a model that was commissioned around 1966 by Hans Kroch with historians and architects, and using Professor Avi Yonah and students doing the building. And evidently they built it at various places around Israel and then put the whole thing together in its present location about 2006. Now, the picture we have here is basically showing the fortress of Antonio, where it apparently is attached to the northern wall of the temple complex. You can see the background are the walls of Jerusalem itself and houses of the upper classes. In inspecting the fortress, we see the foreground, a lower gate. However, on the opposite side, there's another gate a few levels higher. And then on the side of the building is probably another gate. Now, we can picture Jesus was possibly on the opposite side when they set off to crucify him. And maybe the Apostle Paul was also on that side when he's being questioned by the authorities. If you can look carefully, you can see the inner courtyard of the fortress, where it could be the place where Jesus had been scourged. Now, this fortress was also the lodgings for each of the Roman governors. During the time of Jesus, Pilate lived there, would stay there. In this case, it was Felix when he was in town. And it was also the garrison for several hundred soldiers who kind of kept the peace. Now, we're going to hear about the horse cavalry a little bit later on, but for the horse cavalry, they probably kept them outside the walls of Jerusalem itself. And they probably bivouacked out there. They may have had, stalls and things like that for the horses outside the walls. Now, to give you a little bit of interesting information as we start here, the whole temple complex, with the walls that you see, the temple complex itself sat on Mount Moriah, and within its walls covered an area of roughly 35 acres. Much of it being the courts of the Gentiles, plus an area for the inner workings of the temple, the inner courts, and then the Holy of Holies. Now, comparing this to the city of Jerusalem, which sat on probably 4 mounts. Now, you can look at these mounts. If you were to go up to Boone, and you're on 422, on the main highway going up there, and there's places where you can stop and look out, and you can see how the hills bounce around, and valleys in here, and this hill, more hills there. This is kind of what you're going to have, coming to Jerusalem. It's valleys and hills. Now, Jerusalem itself is built on now 7 of the hills. But back then, probably just had, Mount Moriah was the Temple Mount. Mount Zion was the residential mount, and Mount Opel was another mount. And, there was the high sections, there were walls, and then there was lower sections, there were valleys. And so the upper crust lived probably in the higher areas, and the lower level of folks lived on the lower levels, because there were deep, valleys that separated, even within the city of Jerusalem, and they still are. So now, this was a point of explaining this picture. Now we'll get into chapter 23. Now let's see. Now, if we go through this, we are standing at the foot of the fortress of Antonio, which was located on the north wall of the temple compound. and is the residence of the governor, was in town, and the barracks of Roman soldiers garrisoned there. And imprisoned but unbound, Paul is there facing his accusers. The whole of the Sanhedrim, including the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and probably some of the businessmen of the town. Quite a sight, if you can imagine that. And so we'll start in Acts 23, 1 through 10. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And with that, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him, "Strike him in the mouth." Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" Paul explains to them that he has served God in good conscience. But now let's take a minute. Did Paul really do this? Well, while he was a Pharisee in good standing, he was zealous for the law. He was zealous for the faith. So in that context, he was serving in good conscience. And when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, he became a believer. He did serve in good conscience. He served God, not man. So truly, in all explanations, he did. All right, but now we have Ananias, the high priest, who ordered those who were standing near to Paul to smack him in the mouth. Now, why would he do that? Well, it's not really said, but probably because Paul spoke up first. Paul initiated this whole conversation. The Sanhedrin, in their arrogance, need to be the ones in charge. Therefore, initiate the questioning. Paul calls him on it because it was against the law for a religious figure to order or to do it themselves, to have someone hit. And Paul, calling Ananias a whitewashed wall, here is denoting a wall that was dirty, covered with a coat of white paint, and then meaning that he was calling Ananias as dirty on the inside and masquerading as a holy man or priest on the outside. He also wanted to know how Ananias could order such an action knowing it was against their law. And those who then, going on, and those who stood by said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Then Paul said, "I didn't know, brother, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Someone tells Paul Ananias is the high priest. Could this possibly be the son of Caiaphas, who was the high priest during the trial of Jesus, and whose father-in-law was Ananias, who was also a high priest at one point? Actually, as we have seen Ananias, it was a fairly common name. So there are historical notes who may explain who he is. But it has been 20 years since Paul was involved with the Pharisees, and I would imagine that Paul may still know many of these men who are more his age. So I can't help thinking that he may have known Ananias, but not knowing now that he was the high priest. Also, remembering back, may not have had that high opinion of him then. However, in his way, makes a minor apology. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee." And notice he says, "I am." He says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." See what he did there? This is cute. Paul, knowing the Sanhedrin comprises both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he divides them with this comment. And friends, let me add also that a portion of the Sanhedrim was also comprised of the laymen or businessmen of the Jews. Now he goes on, brothers, I stand here, a Pharisee and a son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial for my hope in the resurrection of the dead. Smart on his part, in that he knows what the division is, that the Sadducees did not believe in the life after death, or the angels, or the spirits. And the Pharisees did, because he has been preaching regarding the risen Messiah all these years. And this is the crux of the Jews' dilemma with the rise of Christianity. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, no angel, nor spirit. But the Pharisees confess both. So we see the division clearly defined. Paul, I feel, did this on purpose, to keep the confusion up, but at the same time make them think as to what the purpose to this whole debacle was. Going on, then there was a loud outcry. And the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. This divides the Sanhedrin and sets up an outroar and a lot of debate. And some of the Pharisees declare that this man is innocent. The words spoken by the scribes echo the wording of Gamaliel, of carefully looking at both sides, spoken by Gamaliel regarding Jesus. However, with the way Paul has put things, the attention has now fallen away from him and placed squarely on their inner divisions. Then going on saying, now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. Now, if we go back to that picture we just started with, whether they were in that lower level or they might have been the upper level, Paul has gone down the steps. Number one, they're not going to come up there. But Paul goes back and forth between Gentile and Jew now, so it doesn't bother him. So he may have gone down close enough to them that they can all hear what he's saying and he can hear them. But now we can see that Paul has diffused his situation, but ignited the differences within the Sanhedrin itself. But the overall anger of these 70 people is high, and the commander deems it best to get his men down the 20-odd steps and back into the fortress into safety. They grab him, Paul, bring him back up. Now, some question this tactic about its Christian witness. But friends, at least the heat was temporarily off. You know, sometimes when we talk about that, it's a case of when I have a mob, they don't listen to reason. And it's best not to make yourself a martyr that you can go on. It's, you know, the martyr comes if I'm just taken while I'm doing it peacefully and they kill me. That's a little bit different. But the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. Well, I guess for his safety, Paul spends the night as a prisoner, bunking in at the fortress of Antonia, and it is there that the Lord visits him. Notice the Lord comes into a Gentile building. But he comes to Paul. The Spirit is there. The Spirit is with him. Comforted with the news that as he's testified about Jesus in Jerusalem, so he will also do in Rome, meaning that he will be safe here in spite of the dangers brewing because he has a date in Rome. And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul." Pretty drastic, don't you think? Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him, but we are ready to kill him before he comes near. The ability to hate is sometimes amazing. Here we have over 40 men, probably from the ranks of the Pharisees, Sadducees, acolytes, maybe young, who are young and eager, who, knowing the hate of anything against their Jewish rules, conspiring under the most extreme vow to kill Paul. And the conspiring takes them to the Sanhedrim leadership with their plot. Now notice the Sanhedrin do not dissuade them. This is so foreign to what God's people should be about. And this leadership seems to have lost all sense of honor. We have seen the worst of mob mentality today, haven't we? It doesn't take much of a mob to get a mob riled up to the point of general destruction and the ability to kill when it is not in their nature to do so. We've seen this over and over in the past number of years in this nation. So when Paul's sister heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Well, take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you, and he has something to say to you." We have heard talk of Paul's father being a Pharisee and a citizen of Rome. Now we meet a relative, Paul's nephew, who was in Jerusalem, and if he was carrying on the tradition of being a Pharisee, he could have been a student of a Pharisee in Jerusalem and was knowing all about the travails of his uncle Paul, and also knowing about this most recent plot to kill him. Well, the heat is back on now, and we see that the zealousness of the Jews for their religion seemed out of whack. What about the zealousness for the real texts of the law? Where was that? Then the commander took him by the hand, went inside and asked privately, "What is it you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, and the men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." Well, the way this is told, it shows me that this nephew is quite young. If the commander leads him by the hand, so that tells me that he may be a early, mid, or late teen, but a new student, probably shadowing a Pharisee, and is privy privy to the things said and done. It also shows that the Sanhedrin has so little honor that they would allow this sort of illegal activity to proceed. You would think that someone would step in and try to defray feelings and send folks home. And the lad doesn't want to see harm come to his Uncle Paul. So the commander is now aware of what is to transpire, and because although Paul is a Jew, he is also that Roman citizen, and it is his responsibility to make sure Paul is kept safe, even from his own countrymen. And he called for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Well, having been well armed and being cautious because Paul was a Roman citizen, and also being judicious regarding the Jews, the commander prepares to spirit Paul out of Jerusalem in the dead of night, while the Jews are sleeping, leaving about 9 o'clock. So he winds up with 470 armed personnel and horses for Paul and his guards. And we have already looked at, we keep the armed personnel, the centurions and all their people can probably all fit into the fortress, and probably the horses and the men who ride the horses and chariots will be probably outside the walls. Now, this is to keep a bit of control because these people are a powder keg, and it wouldn't take much to set them off and have a bit of a bloodbath right there. Now, he wrote a letter in the following manner. Quote, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. All right, I'm going to just hang on. The commander writes a letter to Governor Felix, and by the way, we now know the commander's name. It's Claudius Lysias. We also know that the governor is named Felix. We remember Pontius Pilate? Well, that was his position once. Usually governors were appointed for 3, 4, or 5 at the max years. And then they would go back to Rome. This was kind of a dead-end job. And I think by the time they went back, they were retired and lived on a pension. And apparently, as we shall find out later on, Felix is at the end of his term. He's only got a few more months left to go. And he goes on. Greetings, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, and having learned he was a Roman, and when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused of concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. So what he's done is that he has written this letter. There is no accusations there, but because of the situation, he's going to be sending Paul to him. He explains that Paul was seized and further explains he rescued Paul as he was about to be killed. He finds that Paul is a Roman citizen, so protection should be the foremost. And this letter explains why he sent Paul there. And knowing it's a difficult situation, he's going to not say anything then, from the looks of it, until Paul is safely on the road and gone. And then probably in the next morning, he's going to alert the leaders of the Sanhedrin of what's taken place, and that they are to get representatives and then meet them in Caesarea. Now, we go on. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, which I think is a small town, stop on the way. And the next day, they left the horsemen to go on with him and return to the barracks. Then they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor. They had also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers have also come. And he commanded that he be kept in Herod's praetorium. Probably that was the Herod's jails, cell rooms. But apparently there was a certain amount of freedom in that thing. So the soldiers escorted the party as far as Antipatris. If they go too far, that leaves Jerusalem unprotected. Then the horsemen take Paul on to Caesarea, present the letter to Paul and Paul to the governor Felix. And I would assume the spearmen went back to Jerusalem along with the soldiers. Felix reads the letter and finds Paul was from Cilicia, and thus proving his citizenship, and holds him in Herod's palace, probably in the dungeons there.